This is Vanessa Gorman. We've already looked at a lot of subordinate clauses that generally take the indicative mood. Now we're going to look at subordinate clauses with the subjunctive and optative moods. And this is where you will mostly see subjunctive and optatives. There are some independent ones we'll treat later, but most of them are in subordinate clauses. And as a result, you really don't have to worry about them much because they are in the subordinate clause and you see them there. Remember that each conjugated verb has person, number, tense, mood, and voice. And up until now, all we've talked about is the indicative, which is generally used for declarative statements. There is an imperative that we'll talk about later, which is used for command. And then we have subjunctive and optative, and they're easy to spot, and they're generally not a problem to translate, especially in clauses because you just translate the clause. So a subjunctive, the sense of a subjunctive is, it's sometimes called the unreal mood, and I like that actually. It implies an assumption or a possibility, and it often has that lovely word on that tells you, first off, that there's a subjunctive there. It usually accompanies something that's not indicative. And it just tells you that it's not necessarily a statement of fact. Likewise, optative, you get the word opt in there. It has the sense of wish or potentiality, and sometimes also has on, not as often. The optative is more common than the subjunctive, but the subjunctive only occurs really in three tenses: the present for ongoing action, the aorist for completed past, the perfect for completed past with ongoing results. So this is what we're used to. This isn't anything surprising. But having looked through the first three books of the Hellenica, I can tell you that there were 61 present subjunctives, 60 aorist subjunctives. Those numbers are not that high compared to a lot of words we've seen. And one perfect subjunctive. So clearly, present and aorist is all we really need to worry about. And forming the subjunctive is easy because what you do is you lengthen the theme vowel and you don't add augments in the past. It's simply a matter of you see a form that looks like a normal form but has a long vowel in the connecting the stem to the ending, and you think, must be a subjunctive. So, for example, the ending a becomes eta with a iota subscript. It lengthens the e sound. Likewise, the third person singular, middle, and passive. Etai becomes etai. Usi becomes osi. Ontai becomes ontai. Piece of cake. So, for example, the present subjunctive of lue becomes lue. Luetai becomes luete. Luusi becomes luosi. And luontai becomes luuntai. So it's what you're used to seeing, but there's a long vowel in there. And so that tells you right away, it's probably a subjunctive, and Alphaeus will confirm it for you. Same endings with a weak aorist, strong aorist. It's just very easy to spot subjunctives. Likewise, they are, besides being accompanied by on often, when they're negated, they're usually negated by may instead of oo. And where do we show the subjunctive? Some conditional sentences require the subjunctive, and they will always have the on in them, so you'll know it. Purpose clauses. So clauses when you're trying to say why you're doing something. It's not a real event. It's what you hope to accomplish. So therefore, it's in the subjunctive. Anything that implies some kind of purpose is often in the subjunctive after what we call the primary sequence. So if the main verb is present, future, or perfect, the subordinate clauses that don't take the indicative tend to be in the subjunctive. If the main clause is a past tense, imperfect or aorist, then the verb of the subordinate clause will be optative. So it's not like you have to worry about translating them differently. You just expect them in subordinate clauses. Purpose clauses are introduced with hina most commonly, but also hopos and hos, just meaning in order that. Anything else that implies purpose can work that way too. Sometimes a relative clause takes a subjunctive or optative because it implies purpose in it. So usually after a primary sequence main verb, you will find purpose clauses that have subjunctives. Some fear clauses, some indefinite relative or temporal clauses will have the subjunctive, but you really don't need to worry that much about it. They translate very naturally. So Pharnabates held the envoys. He detained the envoys for a while. Why? So that they could not find any fault. Okay? So this is a negative purpose clause. We have hos, and then we have the may in the mayden instead of uden, right? So that they could not find any fault. This is a subjunctive because it's got a long omega here. If you click on it in Alphaeus, it will tell you it's the subjunctive. Sometimes subjunctives and futures have the same form, but again, it usually context will sort it out. Another example, here's an indefinite temporal clause, which uses mekri, and normally temporal clauses would have the indicative, but in this case, it's indefinite. So they were ordering them to seize the archons, to take Hyreo, this is from Hyreo, to take the archons until those men should arrive, the men should arrive, right? So we don't know when that is. So it's indefinite, and it's made more indefinite by using the subjunctive and on. Is it hard to translate? No. You see mekri, until they arrive. Okay, there's an on in there, so there's a potentiality. It's very, very easy. You don't have to pre-produce them, so recognizing them is a piece of cake. Likewise, optative also has three common tenses: present, aorist, and future. Perfect and future perfect are very, very rare. But even then, what do you see most of all? You mostly see presents. You see a fair number of aorists and just some futures. So perfects, future perfects, almost never. Optatives, again, are so easy to spot because they look like other words, except in that vowel that connects the theme or the stem to the ending, you get a iota. So the sign of the optative is a iota. Again, like subjunctives, you do not put augments in past tenses of the optative or subjunctive. So if you use the secondary endings, you just simply add a iota to them, and you wind up with oi, oito, oin, ointo. So in luo, you drop the augment in the aorist. Luoi, lusoi in the future. Lusai is the weak aorist, or in the case of elipon, lepo here. Lipoi, lipotoi. You see this iota, and that iota says, that's a weird iota. It must be an optative. Okay? Like subjunctives, they're usually negated by may. They are often, but not as often, accompanied by on. And they're used especially in indirect statements and questions that follow a verb in the past tense. And they're only optative because they're in a subordinate clause after the verb in the past tense. So in indirect statements and questions, if the main verb is indicative, the verb of the subordinate clause will be indicative. Or sorry, if the main verb is primary sequence, present or future or perfect, then the verb of the subordinate clause will be indicative. But if it's in the past, you'll have optatives there. You look at the optative, you say, oh, there's a historical tense in the main verb. That's why the optative is there. It doesn't matter. In purpose clauses, again, if the main verb is in the past tense, the verb of the purpose clause will be in the optative. If the verb is in a primary sequence, the verb of the purpose clause will be in the subjunctive. Any conditionals that indicate potentiality also often have the optative. And if you put a subordinate clause within a subordinate clause, sometimes they'll throw that into the optative, just to let you know. Some fear clausing, some temporal clauses, some relative clauses. Causal clauses that allege a cause instead of stating a fact. So, I mean, basically it will show up in oddball places, but if it's in a subordinate clause, you don't need to worry about it. It's there because it's in a subordinate clause. That's all you need to know. Figure out what the verb means, figure out how to translate it. Don't worry about it being optative or subjunctive most of the time. Although if there's an on there, it's going to give you that sense of potentiality. This is one of those cases where if you're not trying to write Greek, it's easy. If you're trying to write Greek, this is hard. If you're trying to memorize all the forms, this gets just, amplifies the work. Whereas if you're just trying to see it when you see it, it's very, very easy. So here's an example. There, ekai, they learned, now we have an indirect statement with a hoti. Because the main verb is in the past tense, the verb of the indirect statement becomes optative. That Mindarus was in Cyzicus and Pharnabates was with the infantry. So it's only in the optative because it's in a subordinate clause after the past tense, an indirect statement after the past tense. You can see it's optative because it's got this weird form. He was pursuing him so that he could not flee to that place. Here we have a purpose clause in the negative. So we have made and negated. Holpos introduces the purpose clause. And its main verb, edioken, is in the past tense. So therefore, the verb of the purpose clause is the optative. For the seer told them, right? The mantis announced to them. What does he announce? Something in the infinitive. Not to attack. Proteron, before, and then we have a temporal clause before someone, anyone, fell or killed. So was wounded or killed. Sorry, was killed or wounded. Sorry. These are in the optative because we've got this indefinite sense in here, and everything is in the past tense. So temporal clause referring to the future, and it's the sense of indefinite. So all these are good reasons to have it in the optative. Okay. Let's talk about conditional sentences. Remember the than clause, the main clause is the apodosis. The if clause is the dependent clause, is the prodosis. And it's introduced by a, but in the case of prodosis, if a prodosis should have an on in it, it's usually introduced by aon as a shortcut for the conjunction of aon, or they just put on and you have to assume the a in there. So if you sometimes will see a clause that seems to be beginning with an on, it could well be a subordinate conditional clause. So that word is labeled as auxi, and it hangs on the verb of the apodosis. The verb of the prodosis hangs on the a and is labeled as an adverb most of the time. So we've already talked about some kinds of conditional sentences. The simple present, if I do this, this happens. The present unreal, if I were to do this, this would happen. Remember, you take the on there because there's a certain unreality. It's a contrary to fact. Now, there's also what we call present generals, which are simply kind of gnomic statements of truth that apply whenever. And they have an indicative in the apodosis to indicate that it's a statement of truth, but they have either subjunctive or optative in the prodosis in the sense of whenever this happens. So we get this indefinite sense that puts it into the subjunctive or optative. Subjunctive with a present tense, optative with a past tense. So, for example, he was not allowing Lysander to sail out against the Athenians if he did not hold many more ships. So until he had more ships, and whenever that time might be. So that gives that sense of indefiniteness to the sentence. Aeon plus may plus the present subjunctive. Clearly the verb upon which it depends, the pneumachein, is in the infinitive, but it stands for a finite present indicative verb. In the past, we get the same kind of thing. The main sentence is, it seemed best to them to inhabit Eleusis. Sorry, that should be the subject. It seemed best to them. To inhabit Eleusis seemed best to them. So that should be the subject. If anyone was afraid, if certain men were afraid of those in the city, then it was a good idea to inhabit Eleusis. So anyone, whoever might, in case someone's there who is afraid, right? So it gives us that sense of indefinite, um, anyone at all. It's not these certain people. And then finally, we have what are called future vivid. Um, Future more vivid, meaning it's very likely to happen. Future less vivid, meaning it's less likely to happen. So future more vivid, the main verb is in the future indicative, but the protasis is aeon plus the subjunctive. If I do this, this will happen. I'm stating it with a great deal of certainty. If it's a plus the optative, optative plus on, notice this is the only place where we have anything but the indicative in the apodosis. Then we get into the should would. If it should happen, I would react, but I don't expect it to happen. So a future more vivid, they were teaching someone, him, that this clause, this hoti clause is acting substantively as the object of what they're teaching him, that the sailors of the Athenians will abandon their ships, future indicative, they will abandon their ships if, and here's a case where on stands for aeon, and you label it as an auxi, the pay becomes greater. Or sorry, the pay is this. If the pay becomes this, so if you raise their pay is the sense of it. If you pay them this much, they will abandon their ships. So we have aeon plus the subjunctive and then a future indicative. So we've got a future more vivid. This is definitely going to happen. All you got to do is pay them this much and they will abandon their ships. Future less vivid, he recognized that, another substantive clause, he would not be able to make war on the plains if he did not possess sufficient cavalry. If he should not possess sufficient cavalry, he would not be able to make war on the plains. There's certain implication that, on the other hand, that's not true. He does have enough cavalry, so he can do this. So a future less vivid has this sense of less likely to be true. A future more vivid has a much better sense of being likely to happen. So again, we have a plus an optative, which is negated by may, and then and then an optative as well in the main verb.